The meeting took place at 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill on a February afternoon in 1932, in the apartment where Stephanie St. Clair lived among Harlem's most prestigious residents. Du Bois down the hall, future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall 2 floors up. Painter Aaron Douglas across the courtyard end, when the young man with the bump on the back of his head was escorted into her living room by one of her well-dressed lieutenants. He didn't yet understand that the woman sitting in the high-backed chair wearing an exotic dress with a turban wrapped around her head and a fur coat draped dramatically over her shoulders was about to change trajectory of his entire life. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 26 years old, had been running small operations in Harlem for several years after arriving from South Carolina as teenager, had developed reputation for intelligence and controlled violence that made him a valuable asset in a neighborhood where most enforcers relied on intimidation over He'd been summoned to meet with woman whose name everyone in Harlem knew, even though most people outside black community had never heard of her, Madame Estefanie St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers, the most powerful criminal operator in Harlem, the woman who'd built multi-million-dollar gambling empire while white gangsters were still figuring out how prohibition worked. Mr. Johnson, she said in flawless French-accented English that reflected her West Indies upbringing and education her single mother had sacrificed everything to provide. I've been watching your operations for past 6 months, and I'm impressed by how you handle conflicts with intelligence rather than just violence, with strategy rather than just intimidation. I need someone like you in my organization, not as peripheral player but as chief enforcer, someone who understands that real power comes from being smarter than your enemies rather than just more brutal than them. This was 1932, and Stephanie Clair was at peak of her power, had been running Harlem's numbers rackets since 1917, when she'd invested $10,000 of money she'd made from previous boyfriend who'd tried to strangle her when she wanted to leave him, and whom she'd accidentally killed by pushing him away with force that cracked his skull against table, had built operation that employed hundreds of runners who went door to door taking bets from community members who couldn't invest legally in white-controlled banks, had accumulated personal fortune of $500,000 in cash, almost $8 million in today's money, plus ownership of several apartment buildings, had established herself as businesswoman who reinvested profits in community rather than extracting wealth like white criminals who saw Harlem only as territory to exploit. But she was also facing new threat that required enforcer with capabilities beyond what her current organization provided. Dutch Schultz, the Bronx mob boss, with legendary temper and violent methods, had decided after Prohibition ended that Harlem's gambling operations would compensate for decreased alcohol revenues, and he was using tactics that Clair's newspaper runners couldn't defend against, beating operators who wouldn't pay protection, killing those who resisted, bribing police to raid St. Clair's operations while ignoring his own, leveraging political connections that black women from West Indies simply couldn't access in New York's racist power structure. Bumpy understood immediately what she was offering. Not just job, but education from someone who'd mastered skills he was still learning. Opportunity to work with women whose strategic intelligence and business acumen exceeded anyone else operating in Harlem's underworld. Chance to be part of organization that actually served community rather than just exploiting it. What do you need me to do? He asked simply, understanding that elaborate responses would insult women who valued directness over diplomatic I need you to protect our operations from Dutch Schultz's encroachment, she said, explaining conflict that would define next several years of their partnership. But I don't just need muscle, I need intelligence. Schultz has political connections and police protection that we can't match through violence alone. So we're going to fight him using methods he doesn't expect from black criminals, who he assumes are less sophisticated than Italian mob. We're going to attack his storefronts, tip off police about his operations, even though they're supposed to be protecting him, take out newspaper ads, exposing corruption that he relies on, make him spend so much time defending himself that he can't effectively attack us. Have you ever realized that history you've been told was incomplete? That man, celebrated as Harlem's king, was actually working for a woman whose name has been largely forgotten. That most dangerous criminal operator in neighborhood wasn't the one whose legend survived, but the one who strategically stepped back when stepping forward became too costly. Subscribe to understand how Stephanie St. Clair built Bumpy Johnson into legend while operating as true power behind throne. The partnership between Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson from 1932 until approximately 1935 wasn't traditional boss-enforcer relationship where muscle follows orders without understanding. Strategist was mentorship, where a brilliant woman who understood both legitimate business and illegal operations taught intelligent man how power actually worked when deployed by people who couldn't rely on structural advantages that white criminals took for granted. She taught him about numbers banking, how it functioned as underground stock market for community members who were denied access to legitimate investment opportunities, how runners collected bets and bankers managed risk, how winning numbers were calculated based on New York clearinghouse figures to ensure fairness that built community trust, how operation could be profitable while still serving social function that exploitative white-controlled gambling didn't provide. She taught him about political dynamics, how to identify which police officers could be bribed and which ones were too honest or too racist to negotiate with, how to recognize which politicians needed black votes and would provide protection in exchange for delivering those votes, how to understand difference between enemies who wanted to destroy you and competitors who just wanted their share of profits and could become allies against common threats. She taught him about community relations, how to maintain respect by being fair arbiter rather than arbitrary dictator, how to provide services that legitimate authorities wouldn't provide to black neighborhood, how to balance criminal operations with genuine commitment to community well-being so that residents protected you from police rather than cooperating with authorities who they didn't trust anyway. Most importantly, she taught him about strategic use of publicity, how to take out newspaper ads that exposed enemies, corruption, while building her own reputation as businesswoman who wouldn't be intimidated, how to speak directly to community through media in ways that made it impossible for authorities to ignore issues she raised, how to turn transparency into weapon when operating in shadows would have made her vulnerable to false accusations and unsubstantiated rumors. Bumpy absorbed everything she taught him, and he implemented strategies that made him invaluable to her operations during war with Dutch Schultz that escalated throughout 1932 and 1933 period when more than 40 people died in gang violence as Dutch attempted to forcibly take over Harlem's numbers. Raucous while St. Clair and Johnson refused to pay protection or submit to Italian mob's control. The attacks on Dutch Schultz's storefronts were Bumpy's operations, but St. Clair's strategy. Rather than just defending their own territory, they went on offense against Dutch's businesses throughout Harlem, destroying property that Dutch couldn't easily replace because he didn't have same community relationships that St. Clair had cultivated over 15 years of reinvesting in neighborhood. The police tips were coordination between St. Clair's intelligence network and Bumpy's tactical implementation. As Clair knew which operations Dutch was running, and when, Bumpy knew which police officers could be convinced to act on information if it was presented correctly. And together they orchestrated raid that resulted in arrest of dozens of Dutch's employees and seizure of approximately $12 million, devastating blow to operation that relied on appearing invincible to intimidate competitors. The newspaper ads were pure Clair. Full-page declarations in Amsterdam News and other black newspapers that catalogued police corruption, documented payoffs that Dutch was making to authorities who were supposed to be arresting him, exposed political connections that allowed white criminals to operate openly while black operators faced constant harassment that infuriated Dutch because he couldn't respond through same channel without confirming accusations, and that put pressure on corrupt officials who didn't want their activities publicized, even in newspapers that white power brokers didn't read. Comment below whether you've ever worked with someone whose intelligence made you better at what you did, who taught you that success came from thinking differently rather than just working harder, who showed you that being underestimated could be strategic advantage rather than limitation. But the partnership also had costs that neither St. Clair nor Bumpy had fully anticipated. Dutch Schultz had political connections that black woman from West Indies simply couldn't overcome, regardless of how brilliant her strategy was, had police protection that made defending their operations require constant vigilance that exhausted resources, had willingness to use level of violence that St. Clair didn't want to match because escalating to indiscriminate brutality would destroy community relationships she'd spent years building. By 1935, Clair was facing reality that continuing to fight Dutch Schultz was becoming unsustainable. She was spending more time defending operations than growing them, was under constant police surveillance that made every move risky, was watching her organization get worn down by attrition warfare that Dutch could sustain longer because he had deeper resources and structural advantages that racism provided to white criminals. So she made strategic decision that most male gangsters wouldn't have made. She recognized when stepping back was smarter than continuing to fight, losing battle, when passing operational control to protas she'd trained was better alternative than watching everything she'd built get destroyed, when tactical retreat preserved more than Pyrrhic victory would have won. She transferred most of her numbers banking operations to Bumpy Johnson in 1935, with understanding that Bumpy would negotiate deal with Italian mob, specifically Lucky Luciano, who was more interested in profits than in territorial domination and who recognized that working with Bumpy rather than trying to destroy him was more profitable for everyone involved. The deal Bumpy negotiated after Clair's step back was exactly what she'd trained him to accomplish. Lucky Luciano took over Dutch Schultz's operations after Schultz was assassinated by the Commission in October 1935 for refusing to follow orders and for being so volatile that he'd become liability to organized crimes interests. Bumpy became Luciano's representative in Harlem, with percentage of profits and authority to manage operations without constant interference. Italian mob agreed to consult with Bumpy before making any major decisions affecting Harlem rather than just imposing their will on community they didn't understand. Clair sent infamous telegram to Dutch Schultz as he lay dying in hospital from wounds suffered in assassination she hadn't ordered but certainly approved of philosophically, as the so shall the reap signed. Madame Quine of policy final taunt that made headlines across nation and cemented her reputation as woman who'd stood up to violent mob boss and outlasted him, even though she hadn't fired shot that killed him. This is where most histories of Harlem's underworld focus exclusively on Bumpy Johnson and treat Stephanie Clair as peripheral figure who retired from numbers game and faded into that fundamentally misunderstands power dynamics that existed between them, that erases woman who built empire and trained king in order to center story on man whose legend is more marketable, that treats strategic decision to step back as defeat rather than as demonstration of intelligence that most male gangsters lacked. The truth about Stephanie Clair's relationship with Bumpy Johnson wasn't that she retired in defeat after Dutch Schultz forced her out of numbers. It was that she made calculated decision to transition from visible operations to strategic influence, from being target the police and mob bosses focused on, to being advisor whose power was harder to attack because it operated through proxy, who could navigate male-dominated criminal world more easily than French-speaking black women from West Indies could, regardless of how intelligent or successful she was. From 1935 until her actual retirement in early 1940s after serving prison sentence for shooting her husband, Sufi Abdul Hamid, religious and labor leader known as Black Hitler, for his anti-Semitic views, whom she'd married in late 1930s and shot after discovering he was having an affair with Dorothy Fufadime Matthews, fortune teller, who he eventually married after seeing. Clair and Hamid divorced. Stephanie maintained influence over Harlem's underworld operations through Bumpy Johnson, who consulted with her on major decisions, who protected her from threats that emerged after she stepped back from daily operations, who understood that his success was built on foundation she'd constructed and training she'd provided. Have you ever watched someone step back from visible position while maintaining actual power? Seen woman operate behind scenes because stepping forward would make her target that male ego couldn't tolerate. Understood that sometimes greatest demonstration of strength is knowing when direct approach becomes less effective than indirect influence. Leave a like if you recognize that history often remembers names while forgetting who actually held power. The relationship between St. Clair and Bumpy during this period wasn't secret in sense that they were hiding connection. Everyone in Harlem knew that Bumpy had worked for St. Clair, that he'd learned from her, that he respected her judgment in ways he didn't respect most people's opinions, but it was secret in sense that white authorities and Italian mob bosses who dealt with Bumpy as if he'd independently built his operation didn't realize extent to which he was still implementing strategies that St. Clair had developed, still consulting with women whose intelligence exceeded anyone else in Harlem's underworld, still operating as visible face of power structure where she remained invisible architect. This arrangement worked because it served both their interests. Bumpy got credit that established his reputation as Harlem's king, which made negotiations with Italian mob easier because they could deal with him as peer rather than as representative of women they didn't respect, which reduced violence that would have resulted from mob bosses feeling emasculated by being forced to negotiate with black woman who was smarter than they were. Unseen. Clair got what she actually wanted, which wasn't fame or recognition, but influence and security. Influence over operations that affected communities she cared about, security from constant police harassment and mob violence that came with being visible target, freedom to focus on activism and legitimate business interests while still benefiting from criminal operations she'd built. The newspaper ads that St. Clair took out in late 1930s weren't just about exposing police corruption anymore. They were detailed catalogs of her own activities, creating public record that served as defense against false criminal charges by demonstrating that anything she was accused of was already documented in ways that made it impossible to add fabricated charges without contradicting her own advertisements about what she'd actually done. This strategy was brilliant because it used transparency as shield. By making her activities public record before authorities could accuse her of them, she controlled narrative in ways that most criminals couldn't because they relied on secrecy that made them vulnerable to any accusations authorities wanted to make, true or false. The activism that St. Clair engaged in throughout late 1930s and 1940s wasn't separate from her criminal operations. It was extension of same commitment to community well-being that had made her numbers. Banking different from exploitative white-controlled gambling. Same understanding that serving black communities' interests rather than just extracting wealth from them created loyalty that made her operations sustainable in ways that purely predatory criminality never could be. She wrote columns about police brutality, about illegal search and seizure, about discrimination that black Harlem residents faced from authorities who were supposed to serve everyone equally, but who actually operated as occupying force in black neighborhood they viewed with contempt, rather than as community they were responsible for protecting. She advocated for immigrant rights, drawing on her own experience coming from West Indies to country that offered opportunities while simultaneously imposing barriers that limited how those opportunities could be accessed by people who weren't white, who weren't born in the United States, who weren't willing to accept second-class citizenship without challenging structural racism that maintained it. She funded community programs that helped new immigrants learn English and develop social networks that would enable them to succeed in an urban environment that could be overwhelmingly hostile to people who didn't already have established connections. Programs that created sense of belonging that made difference between people who thrived and people who got exploited by systems designed to extract rather than support. All of this activism was possible because she'd built financial security through criminal operations, because Bumpy was managing day-to-day aspects of numbers banking that would have required her constant attention if she'd remained operationally involved, because stepping back from visible criminal role freed her to engage in public advocacy that would have been undermined by being actively prosecuted for illegal activities. Subscribe for more stories about how real power often operates invisibly, how stepping back can be strategic strength rather than weakness. How Woman Who Built King is often forgotten, while King's legend grows precisely because she understood that being remembered wasn't as important as actually wielding influence that mattered. When Stephanie St. Clair was convicted of assault in late 1930s and sentenced to 2 to 10 years in New York State Prison for Women in Bedford for shooting Sufi Abdul Hamid during trial, where she insisted that if she'd actually wanted him dead, he would be dead rather than just wounded. That gun had gone off during struggle rather than through intentional shooting. That all-white jury was convicting her not because evidence proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt, but because they couldn't imagine black woman from West Indies could be telling truth about defending herself against man who'd been cruel to her. Bumpy Johnson protected her interests while she was incarcerated, managed operations without trying to claim them as entirely his own, maintained respect for mentor who'd made his success possible. When she was released from prison in early 1940s, she didn't return to active criminal operations instead. She lived quietly, focusing on legitimate business interests and continued activism, visiting relatives in West Indies before and during World War II, according to some accounts, owning properties in Harlem and eventually relocating to Long Island Mansion, according to others, maintaining relationship with Bumpy that was based on mutual respect and shared history rather than on current. Operational involvement. In 1960, journalist Ted Poston interviewed St. Clair for New York Post series about history of Harlem numbers racket, and he reported that she'd successfully transitioned from underworld figure to prosperous businesswoman, living lavish lifestyle in 4-story apartment she owned in Harlem. Description. That suggested she'd maintained wealth she'd accumulated during years running numbers game, that stepping back from criminal operations hadn't meant accepting poverty or obscurity, that she'd achieved exactly what she'd intended: security, influence, and freedom to engage in activism without constant threat of prosecution. Mame Johnson, Bumpy's widow, later claimed that St. Clair had relocated to Long Island Mansion and never returned to numbers. Business statement that might seem like contradiction of Poston's reporting about Harlem apartment, but could also be true if St. Clair owned both properties at different times. If she moved from Harlem to Long Island sometime between 1960 interview and her death in if she maintained multiple residences the way wealthy people often do. What's certain is that Stephanie St. Clair died in 1969 at age 72, 1 year after Bumpy Johnson died of heart attack at Wells Restaurant in July 1968, ending partnership that had lasted in various forms from 1932 until 1968, spanning 36 years, during which she'd been his mentor, his boss, his strategic advisor, his protected asset after she stepped back from operations, and finally his contemporary in old age, when both of them were living off wealth they'd accumulated and influence they'd maintained while younger. Generation took over Harlem's underworld. Her death wasn't mentioned in any newspaper of the rare remarkable absence, given that her activities in 1930s had regularly made headlines, that her newspaper ads had been widely discussed, that her telegram to Dutch Schultz's deathbed had been national news, that she'd been prominent enough during her criminal career that journalists knew who she was and had interviewed her as recently as 1960. This silence about her death suggests either that she'd successfully transitioned to completely private life that journalists didn't track anymore, or that newspapers simply didn't consider death of elderly black woman who'd been criminal operator 40 years earlier to be newsworthy, compared to other events competing for limited column space, or that she'd specifically arranged for privacy that prevented public announcement of her passing. Whatever the reason, the result was that Stephanie St. Clair's story largely disappeared from public consciousness, except as footnote in histories of Bumpy Johnson or Dutch Schultz, or Harlem Renaissance, as peripheral female character in narratives centered on male criminals whose legends were more marketable, as Numbers Queen, whose title suggested importance without conveying actual power she'd wielded or intelligence she'd demonstrated or legacy she'd created through building both criminal empire and community advocacy that challenged structural racism. This erasure wasn't accidental, it was structural pattern where women's contributions get minimized or forgotten while men's achievements get celebrated and mythologized, where strategic intelligence gets valued less than visible violence when telling stories about crime. where stepping back for smart reasons gets coded as weakness or retirement rather than as demonstration of wisdom that most male gangsters lacked. The real story of Stephanie Clair and Bumpy Johnson isn't a story about male king who briefly worked for female mentor before building his own empire. It's story about brilliant woman who built Harlem's first major criminal fortune, who taught intelligent man everything he knew about power and strategy, who made calculated decision to let him be visible face of operations while she maintained influence from position that was harder for enemies to attack, who understood that being remembered was less important than actually accomplishing goals that mattered to her. Bumpy Johnson became legend because Stephanie Clair made him legend not through false claims, like Frank Lucas would later make, but through genuine mentorship that taught him how to think strategically rather than just act violently, how to serve community while running illegal operations, how to navigate between legitimate and illegitimate power structures in ways that most criminals couldn't because they didn't have her intelligence or her understanding of both business and politics. When Bumpy died in 1968, he'd been Harlem's reigning king for 3 decades, position that seemed entirely his own achievement to people who didn't know history. That appeared to be a result of his intelligence and strategic thinking without recognizing that those skills had been trained into him by women who'd mastered them first. That looked like independent empire without understanding that foundation had been built by mentor whose name most people had forgotten by time Bumpy became famous. And when Stephanie Clair died 1 year later, in 1969, she passed away knowing that she'd accomplished everything she'd intended. She'd built first major black-controlled numbers banking operation in Harlem, had stood up to Dutch Schultz, and outlasted him, even though she'd been disadvantaged by both racism and sexism that limited her ability to fight on equal terms. Had trained Bumpy Johnson to continue operations in ways that served community rather than just extracting wealth from it. Had transitioned from criminal operations to activism and legitimate business without losing wealth or influence she'd accumulated. Had lived to see neighborhoods she loved go through massive changes while maintaining respect from people who knew what she'd contributed during her years running Harlem's Underworld. The fact that her death wasn't mentioned in newspapers, that her name largely disappeared from historical accounts, that Bumpy Johnson got celebrated while she got forgotten, none of that mattered to her goals, because her goals were never about fame or recognition or having her name remembered by people who didn't understand what she'd actually accomplished. Her goals were about building black economic power in a neighborhood that structural racism had relegated to second-class status, about providing investment opportunities to community members who were denied access to legitimate financial institutions, about standing up to Italian mobs' encroachment without submitting to protection rackets that exploited rather than served black community, about training someone who could continue work after she stepped back, about using whatever influence she had to challenge police brutality and discrimination, and all the other ways that racism made life harder for black people in Harlem. And she achieved all of those goals through combination of intelligence, strategy, audacity, and willingness to operate invisibly when being visible would have made her target that threatened everything. She'd built qualities that made her most dangerous operator in Harlem, even though most people outside black community never knew her name. Most dangerous ally Bumpy Johnson ever had, even though histories treat their relationship as boss-employee rather than as mentor-protege partnership that made Bumpy's entire career possible. That's the secret that history forgot while remembering Bumpy's legend. The woman who ruled Harlem wasn't the one whose name survived in movies and documentaries and casual conversations about organized crime, wasn't the one who got portrayed in films as larger-than-life character, wasn't the one whose mythology got built up through decades of storytelling that emphasized drama over accuracy. The woman who ruled Harlem was the one who built empire before Bumpy became king, who taught him everything he knew about power and strategy, who stepped back when stepping back was smarter than continuing to fight battles that structural advantages made unwilling. For black women operating in male-dominated racist society, who maintained influence through invisible channels that most people never recognized because they were looking at wrong person when trying to identify where power actually resided. Stephanie Clair was Bumpy Johnson's most dangerous ally, not because she was violent, though she could be when necessary, as Dutch Schultz learned when she refused to submit to his intimidation, but because she was intelligent in ways that violence couldn't match, strategic in ways that most criminals couldn't comprehend, committed to community in ways that made her operations serve rather than just exploit, and wise enough to know when stepping back from visible position was actually step forward in terms of maintaining real influence that mattered more than public recognition. That wisdom, knowing when to step back, knowing how to maintain power without being visible target, knowing that legacy could be preserved through training successor rather than through insisting on remaining operationally involved until forced out eyes, what made her most dangerous operator in Harlem's history. More dangerous than Bumpy, despite being less famous. More dangerous than Dutch Schultz, despite losing visible battle for control. More dangerous than any of male gangsters who thought power meant never retreating, because they didn't understand that strategic retreat preserved more than Pyrrhic victory ever could. The woman who ruled Harlem in secret was never secret to people who actually understood power. She was only secret to people who confused visibility with influence, who thought being remembered meant more than actually accomplishing goals, who assumed that because they didn't hear her name, she must not have been important. But to Bumpy Johnson, who owed everything he became to training she'd provided, to community members who'd benefited from her advocacy and her refusal to exploit them the way white criminals did, to anyone who actually studied Harlem's history rather than just consuming mythology about legendary gangsters, to all of them, Clair was exactly what she deserved to be remembered as: the queen who made the king, the strategist who built the empire. The woman who ruled Harlem by being smarter than everyone else, even when being smarter meant letting someone else get credit for success she'd made possible.